Alright, so now we're going to look at China after World War II. So we're looking at the years from 1946 to, I don't know, 1989. So a lot happens in those 40, 50 years. Okay. Dun, dun, dun. Click. Alright. So, as you can imagine, China's condition after the war is devastating, right? Much like Europe and throughout the Pacific, World War II takes a toll on China. So now, as soon as the Japanese are defeated, the civil war or this conflict between the Kuomintang, the nationalists, and the communists heats up. And so they're going to duke it out for who will take control of China. So this time, it's for all the marbles. So the Kuomintang, the odds are in their favor, right? They outnumber the communists, and U.S. continues to send aid to the nationalists. So this would be part of our containment or fighting communism. And they receive $2 billion from the United States. However, the communists have popular support, right? As the economy collapses after the war, thousands desert the nationalist forces and head to the PLA, or the Red Army. And so by the spring of 1949, China's major cities have fallen to the communists. So on October 1949, dun, 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 there he is, Mao Zedong proclaims the founding of the People's Republic of China here in Tiananmen Square. And look at the flag. It looks vaguely familiar, perhaps like the Soviet flag. And so now here's the Forbidden City, no longer forbidden, open to everybody, because China's for the people. So what happens to Jiang and the nationalists? Well, they get out of Dodge. So they leave China and flee to Taiwan. So here is Jiang Jieshi with our friends, Franklin Roosevelt, Churchill, in Cairo of 1943 during World War II. And so they flee to Taiwan. So what are the Cold War implications? Well, now you have two Chinas, right? There's the People's Republic and there's Taiwan. Both are going to claim they're China, but let you guess, which one does the United States support? So they, of course, are going to support the nationalists in Taiwan. So the problem is, like we have a bad habit of doing during the Cold War, is Jiang Jieshi is not the best guy. He's essentially a dictator, but he's not a communist, so we're going to have his back. And so sometimes, I don't know, not that I guess we can support Mao exactly. So, so China's divided in the Cold War. I mentioned this when we were talking about the Korean War, ding ding ding, that will cause complications between the United States and the Soviet Union, because we'll recognize Taiwan, China will get mad, or I mean Soviets will get mad because we won't recognize the PRC, the People's Republic. Okay, so let's see how the communists do. How do they transform China? So they gotta expand. So by 1950, they're ready to expand and enlarge the borders of China. The first and probably the most famous example is Tibet. So Tibet, before 1950, is ruled by the Dalai Lama, the God King of Tibet. So Tibetan Buddhism is kind of its own thing, and they have these. The Dalai Lama that's not his name, that's his title, and there he is as a young man. So as they come in, you can see it's ugly and brutal, and the Dalai Lama, the king, but he's also divine, has to leave Tibet, and he is still alive today, but he has to live in India. The Chinese won't let him come back into Tibet. So that's probably the most famous example. Now they're going to try to get China up and going for the 20th century. So the Communist Party in China, almost similar to the Soviet Union, is only a small percentage of the actual population. And these guys are old school Marxists, and they're going to do something similar to what Stalin does. And that means they seize the land for the peasants. Um, so if you're a landlord, it's not looking awesome. So they're going to nationalize the industry, right? All the industry then becomes state owned and operated. And if you have any fears, don't worry. You got some propaganda to tell you it's going to be awesome. Look how awesome you are, right? As you prepare for this industrialization. So they collect the farms, and put them into these state-run farms. Okay, so probably the most infamous there of Mao's reforms is something called the Great Leap Forward, and this happens in 1958. So see, propaganda, just like the Soviets, and it's his biggest economic move. And what this is collectivization on a large scale, and they call these communes. I'm pretending this is China, but this is what they would do, right? The parents would go out and work in the fields, and then another group of people would like raise the kids and have schools and do other things. The problem is, I mean, this sounds nice, right? We're all working together and feeding our nation. So it's not, the money's not going to wealthy landlords, but it's inefficient, right? You got 15,000 acres with only 25,000 people farming it. So the results are similar to what happened in the Soviet Union with collectivization. Crop failures. The Chinese don't really stop having their own private businesses, and so they kind of distract from the main goal. Plus, this leads to a famine, in which 20 million die. And so it ends, I guess it's cut off there in 1961. Mao has to realize it's not working. It's also in the 60s that the friendship with the Soviet Union wanes. So the Americans soon will take advantage of this. And something when we were fighting in Korea, I think we assumed, and frankly in Vietnam, that we assume if you're communist, you're all on the Stalin's team. But that's not always true. Okay, so moving right along. The next probably main focus for Mao is 1966, and this is the Cultural Revolution. So why does it happen? He's starting to step back, and other leaders are coming to the forefront, right? He's reducing his role in the government. And this idea of who is really the leader of communism. Remember, initially, Joseph Stalin doesn't care about communism everywhere. He mostly concerns himself about the Soviet Union. By this point, Stalin is dead, and has been for probably 10 years. And now Mao decides he wants the Chinese to be the leaders of what communism is. So he wants to revive communism in China. Mao's kind of interesting guy. I mean, Stalin, cold-blooded. Mao, I think, was this idealist and really thought these Marxist things would work. So he just kind of pushes it through. So he's kind of reminding everybody that the hero is the peasant, right? And they form this Red Guard. And the Red Guard are like high school students, college students, and they're kind of these zealots for Mao. And so they implement this revival, and so the idea is to learn revolution by making revolution. So people who were just never kind of with Mao and this communism are sent to the countryside to be purified by hard labor. So a lot of intellectuals, especially those people that are liking Western European literature and philosophy, the Red Guard and Mao's people think if they go out and work hard, they'll be reminded, right? If they live the life of the peasant, they'll be like, oh yeah, communism is awesome. What really happens, of course, are thousands of people are executed. Does it remind you of anything? Maybe the purges, right? It's not, millions are killed, but they're sort of, Mao's kind of leading this purge of communism in China so that, in a sense, they're getting back on track. So here are some pictures, and remind me, I actually, when I was in China, I bought a copy of the Red Book, which, the irony, right? What would Mao think? So we've got these propaganda posters. This is similar to the one I have in my classroom, right? See the international people? in the 60s, Africa, India, they're all declaring independence, and Mao's trying to say, hey, folks, no matter where you are, communism is for you. And so he put all these like little statements and motivational speeches in these red books. And so these are the Red Guard, right? Young people, kind of mean, forcing people to come along on board. And you had to have the red book with you at all times, see? And then here are some last vestiges of landlords, any Western intellectuals who are sort of being purged. Some believe that Mao maybe didn't intend for all of this to happen, that people just kind of got over the top. But regardless, it wasn't great for a lot of people, and it was kind of a scary time, because if you weren't on board, you could get in serious trouble. Okay, so I found this cartoon, right, because this is what it was in 1949, but how do we get to China today, right? When I was in China, our joke, I was with other nerdy history teachers, and we were always thinking, what would Chairman Mao do if he saw China? So how do we go from this to this? It is due to this man, Deng Xiaoping. So let's take it by decade here. China in the 1970s, they start to look for economic reform. Not political reform, but definitely economic reform. So Zhou Enlai, there he is, he becomes the premier. I mean, he's really been controlling China with Mao since 1949, but he now becomes kind of the forefront leader. And he is a moderate. He's worried about China's isolation, and he starts to reach out to the West. And here you have it. In 1971, they bring the American table tennis team to China. If you compete in the Olympics, you call it table tennis. If you're playing in your parents' basement, we call it ping pong. And this was a huge deal, right? What? Americans coming into China. By 1972, Nixon, right, the President of the United States, comes to China. There he is with his wife on the Great Wall. Here he is toasting Zhou Enlai and what? Shaking hands with Mao Zedong. By 1976, Mao and Zhao die, and the Chinese continue this relationship with the West. And by 1979, we establish diplomatic relationship. So they're kind of, we're sort of thawing things with the Soviet Union, but we really are. I mean, right? President Nixon is not going to Moscow. Okay, but in the 80s, things get heated up. And this is where really China transforms. So Deng Xiaoping then takes over from Zhou Enlai and Mao, but he's old school, right? There he is, 1937, and he participated in the Long March. So he comes up with 4 modernizations, right? He's going to get rid of these communes, and they're going to lease the land to the farmers, and the farmers then will pay rent through food to the state. He's going to allow for private businesses, right? And if you run a state-run industry, these managers were allowed a little bit more freedom. They're obviously going to prove their, that should say technology, to make their army strong and compete with the West. And they start to welcome foreign investment. However, we got some unintended consequences. There's a widening gap between the rich and the poor. It seems like no matter if you go all the way communist or all the way capitalist, it still doesn't help everyone. And with Western investment comes Western political influence. So remember, there's Zhou Enlai with President Ford. So they want economic reform, right? They want to create this kind of China, but they don't want democracy. And that comes to a head in one of the great moments in my opinion, of Chinese history in the last few years is Tiananmen Square demonstrations. We'll talk more about this in class because 1989 was a happening year. So here we have thousands, right? They say Tiananmen Square, there's the Forbidden City, can hold up to 90,000 people. So China is mum on the subject, so no one knows exactly how many people were there, but a lot of people guess it could have been 90,000. So students start this, right? They want democratic reform. Here is this famous goddess of democracy, and they just sort of camp out in Tiananmen Square. I'm running out of time, so Deng Xiaoping, to end it, sends in martial law. And so we'll talk more about what this means. And that's how the demonstration ends, and there is no democracy.